Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I'm speaking today with Jennifer Cohn. I'm so excited to be talking to her, writing for the Bucks County Beacon, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the other projects that you're doing. But thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to Mind Shift Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me on your show. I was very excited to hear from you.
Yes, we've been following each other on Twitter for a while. You've got a few more followers than me, but that's cool. I'm glad to have you on the show because I've been reading your work. Is it primarily for the Bucks County Beacon that you write for, or do you do other platforms as well?
I have in the past done other platforms. I'd say right now it's primarily with the Bucks County Beacon. I really like the editor there. It works really well for me, and I think they're a small but very respected publication. But I do also post my own work, my own stuff on Medium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I read your work in the Bucks County Beacon, I immediately was struck by the similarities to what Catherine Stewart has done. And I noticed you sent me an article, I guess it was last night or this morning, that you just came out with, and you've cited Catherine Stewart. It seems like there is an overlap to that sort of investigative reporting that you're doing into the Christian right, or you call it the Christo-Fascist universe. So what sort of work have you done in terms of getting involved in this in this universe? How did you get involved in studying and researching this?
So what happened was after the 2016 election, I became very concerned about election security because that was the election that was attacked by Russia, which did, by the way, attack our election infrastructure. That is beyond dispute.
Mm-hmm.
The extent to which they did that is the part that we don't really know. But I for years was primarily an election security advocate and writer, and I focused on issues involving the vulnerabilities in our election system with an eye toward addressing them before, for example, the 2020 election. And the Democrats proposed a bill that I know I had some input, some influence on it because I was told by one of the senators involved with it, I was told by a member of their staff who had reached out to me that I had inspired parts of it. So there was a bill called the SAFE Act, and it would have done a lot to make the 2020 election more secure, including banning internet connectivity because some ballot scanning systems do connect to the internet and did before the 2016 election, et cetera. And what happened was the GOP wanted nothing to do with that bill, and they blocked it. And so going into the 2020 election, it really took a lot of, for lack of a better word, chutzpah for the GOP and Trump to run with the idea that because of these vulnerabilities, the election clearly was hacked, and that it was hacked against Trump somehow, because it was the GOP itself that had made the election less secure than it could have been.
How ironic.
So that was quite infuriating to me. And for a while, even amidst the big lie, I continued with my election security advocacy, thinking, okay, let's try to make lemonade out of this lemon. They want audits. That's something that they claim they want audits, at least, right? That's something that experts had long said that we needed. And that was in the bill that was blocked by the GOP. It would have required them not just for the presidential race, but for all of the federal elections. And keep in mind that the GOP had many unexpected victories in federal races in 2020 down the ballot. So I thought, okay, well, maybe we can get them, if nothing else, we could do a standalone bill on election audits and they'll pass it. But unfortunately, the Democrats ran more with sort of a technically true but misleading claim that this was the most secure election ever, which I think it was the most secure election ever, but it should have been more secure, but for the GOP blocking that bill.
Could have been, yeah.
Right. And so they didn't really want to, I don't think, highlight messaging that would then be weaponized by Trump to say, see, they're wanting to secure the election. That must mean that it wasn't secure, which proves I won, which of course it doesn't prove you won. So anyway, I couldn't get any traction on doing a standalone bill. So I had to shift gears, and I shifted toward the people who spread the big lie, the people who took vulnerabilities that I and others had been warning about for years and tried to get addressed, only to have our efforts be blocked by the GOP. I wanted to see who it was that was taking those vulnerabilities. So there's that grain of truth, there were vulnerabilities, mix, and then combining them with a fire hose of falsehoods to create this idea that Trump had somehow won the election and to create all of this outrage that resulted in January 6th. So I started going through the people that had spread a lot of these lies. And I did, I looked at Bannon, and I did an article for The Independent on Bannon, and I did one on Medium for Jack Posobiec, which was based largely on just compiling findings of other journalists, especially Michael Hayden at the Southern Poverty Law Center on Jack Posobiec, who's like an internet Twitter influencer. And then I hit Roger Stone, and I ended up stuck on Roger Stone for like 4 months because he's so much worse than he appears at first blush. He's kind of seems like this caricature cartoon villain. No one takes him seriously, but he was heavily involved in the big lie. And I really think that he and Michael Flynn, even more than Steve Bannon, although Steve Bannon helped promote it, but he and Michael Flynn, in my opinion, really led the Stop the Steal effort. They combined forces. But I even think it started with Roger Stone before Michael Flynn. So I was writing already from 2016 forward. I was going through everything that was involved Roger Stone and his network, which includes Mike Flynn. And I had noticed that they had been talking in strange ways of late. So for example, you had Flynn did that on his Reawaken America tour. He did that speech where he said, we're one nation under God, we need to have only one religion. And people didn't know if he misspoke or what it was. There was that. And then I saw that Roger Stone had been blathering about a supposed demonic portal above Biden's White House, which is very bizarre, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny, and everyone, I thought it was kind of funny and random. But then what happened is another, I call it, I guess, a pro-democracy activist named Nick Knudsen posted a video of 4 men at a rally in Georgia in July this year. And the video went viral because it was this packed stadium at night. So there were just you could just see the stadium was like bursting with people. And the men on stage had this giant jumbotron and neon lights, and they were reciting this decree that was just, for lack of a better word, a Christo-Fascist decree, saying that they had been given legal authority from heaven and hereby exercise that authority. And then they went through like these 10 things, and each line they'd start with, whereas we decree that this, whereas we decree that the courts will issue rulings that are only biblical, whereas we decree that we will, one of the last ones was, we decree that we hereby reclaim and exercise influence over the 7 mountains.
Right.
Okay.
So there's your connection. Yeah, I can see where this is going now.
Yeah. So
you're getting into my territory now, the theology
exactly.
of it all.
So I'd never heard of the 7 mountains. So this is just in July. And I looked in the replies to the tweet, which had 3 million views. Most people expressed horror. Nobody seemed to know who these people were. A guy named Bruce Wilson, who has studied Christian extremism for years, said this is the new Apostolic Reformation. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And I started researching it, and I figured out that they're working with Michael Flynn and, to a lesser extent, Roger Stone, although anyone working with Flynn is by definition working with Stone, in my opinion, because they're basically cohorts now. Everything they do is sort of in tandem with each other. And it turned out that Roger Stone, when he gave that little, the demonic portal talk, he did that on a show called The Elijah List, which is led by a guy named Steve Schultz, who's a leader in the New Apostolic Reformation. And when Michael Flynn gave his "we need to have only one religion" thing, it was during his tour, which at the time might have had a different name, but it's called the Reawaken America Tour. And I found out that it was sponsored by an organization called Charisma News, which was founded by a New Apostolic Reformation leader named Steve Strang. And the rest is history. So then I thought, oh my God, nobody knows this. This is like,
this is all new information.
And then I thought, because I guess the fact that they packed that stadium, I knew to an extent about the Christian right and the dangers of them. And I've had warned about them over the years because it intersects with election security in
Sure.
various ways. But I didn't know that they had that big of a following. And I didn't know, and I knew that people called them dominionists, but I didn't, which means basically dominionism, as you know, is the idea that Christians have a mandate from God to control all aspects of society and ultimately the world. And
Yeah.
that's essentially, as I understand it, dominionism. So I knew that people called some of them dominionists, but I didn't think we could prove that that was ultimately their goal. But you can, when you listen to this decree, which they recited on stage, the Seven Mountains part essentially acknowledges that. And then the express desire in that decree to destroy the separation of church and state so that courts issue only biblical rulings. So that was a game changer for me, that this needed to really be bumped up as a priority. So that's when I did a really big piece for the Bucks County Beacon called Underreported and Massive Theocratic Movement Joins Forces with Michael Flynn and Roger Stone. And it had to do with the Reawaken America tour and all the other connections between MAGA leaders and the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a dominionist movement. And it pushes something called the Seven Mountains Mandate, which is dominionism. It just breaks it down into 7 specific pillars of society over which they strive to achieve that dominion.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is government, one of the most important. And another really important is media. Another really important one is education. And sort of the guy that popularized this is a New Apostolic Reformation, abbreviated NAR leader named Lance Wallnau, who I've written about excessively
Mm-hmm.
now.
Yeah, he's
Since July.
everywhere. Yeah, he's just everywhere. And I remember seeing during the Trump era, Dr. Lance Wallnau. He's some kind of a doctor. I think he got his degree from like the Phoenix University or something like that. But he was leading
Yeah.
Bible studies in Congress and in the Senate during the Trump era, teaching senators, congressmen, and women on the Seven Mountains Mandate, basically saying, look, as Christian politicians, this is what you need to be about. This is your strategy to take dominion, go down these 7 mountains, and whichever one you're called to, or whichever ones, maybe those are the ones over which you need to take dominion. So yeah, he's been around for a few years now. He wrote a book on the Trump Cyrus figure and all that, didn't he?
Well, that's right. He believes that Trump was anointed by God, which is extremely dangerous because that essentially means that Trump can do no wrong. And it also means that the election had if he was anointed by God and God wanted him to win re-election, that means that the devil, right? The abbreviated NAR is the New Apostolic Reformation.
Yeah.
They expressly call Democrats demonic, and they mean it literally, that we're supposedly influenced by Satan. And if you believe that Trump was anointed by God and that God wanted him to have a second term, then by definition, in their belief system, that means that the election had to have been fraudulent. The election that's showing that Biden won instead. That is, if God wanted Trump, obviously, there had to have been fraud. And so they start sort of with that premise and already have, I think, compromised critical reasoning skills and a dominionist agenda. And you end out with a very dangerous situation, as we saw.
Well, look at the logic, because I remember reading an article, it's probably still on the Charisma News website, by Dr. C. Peter Wagner, which is another name. As you mentioned, Dr. Andre Gagne and I, we just did an episode all about sort of the theological backstory, the roots of all these various movements. And Dr. C. Peter Wagner, he was a professor at Fuller Seminary in California, and he was a pivotal figure in actually coming up with the name New Apostolic Reformation. Anyway, he died right before the 2016 election, but he wrote an article in which he stated basically, look, we need to vote for Trump as Christians. The reason is he's already got dominion over at least 3 mountains, over media and business, and he will soon have, dominion over the government mountain if he's elected president. So therefore, God has clearly put him in a position of authority and dominion. So that was C. Peter Wagner's logic. You can just see that. So all critical faculties went out the window as far as like, Trump's a horrible person.
Letter.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And that's why he's arguing that we, or I should say Christians, evangelicals, should vote for Trump, because he's already got at least 2 mountains, if not 3, and so that's kind of the line of argumentation.
That's just crazy. Yeah, C. Peter Wagner is incredibly important. And in the first piece that I did on this issue, I included some quotes from him because he expressly tied the 7 Mountains Mandate to his teachings on dominion. And Lance Wallnau is very attuned to public perception, and he's aware that the public is not yet ready to hear about them taking dominion over the world. And
Mm-hmm.
so, although within his own circles and even in his own books, he uses the phrase dominion or some or words very similar. Publicly, he'll pretend he doesn't know what dominionism is and that he's not a
Mm.
dominionist. They'll try
Yeah.
to come up with their own definition because it's not in the Webster's dictionary, unfortunately. I mean,
Yeah.
dominion is in the sense that it means control, but they'll,
Not in the theological sense, like what they mean it. Yeah.
yeah, he'll just change what it means and say we're not that, but they are. And you can tell because he's a member of the groups established by Wagner within this movement.
Mm-hmm.
And Wagner says it is, and it's obvious that it is. In Wallnau's own book, the prelude to chapter 2 says something. It's really express. How do we take control of the world? We need a strategy, and that's how he sees the seven mountains. And it has been very strategic for them,
It
telling
really
people to get
has.
out of the church and invade whatever mountain appeals to them, whether it's media or education or government.
Yeah, that's
And
exactly right. Whatever mountain you're called to sort of ascend, and in their theology, there's a demonic presence sitting on top of that mountain, and that's the spiritual warfare piece. You have to go into battle with these demonic forces, and that's where there's a whole issue here with apostles and prophets. What have you found in that realm? I mean, obviously, as soon as you start discussing the NAR, you come across apostles and prophets. It's like these networks. What have you found in connection with this election integrity issue?
um, well, what's interesting is because a lot of these Christian extremist groups like to be secretive, they're a little
Mm-hmm.
bit secretive. Their lists tend to be secretive. So although we have older lists, which we can see Wallnau is on the older lists, and maybe there's one or two newer lists. Um, I even got pushback on calling Wallnau a NAR apostle
Yeah.
from someone who wrote, God, he's written for some impressive publication. I can't remember which, but I think he was pretty much finally put in his place by Fred Clarkson.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Or maybe not. Maybe he wasn't. But the thing is, even Wagner called Wallnau an apostle. But whatever you want to call him, he is an extremist. And there certainly are people who pretend or claim, maybe they're not, they claim that they can predict the future. And, and I think that and that they claim that they have a direct line to God and that God speaks to them directly, which is, of course, very dangerous because these people have a lot more followers than I think the general public, well, certainly than the general public is aware of,
Oh,
probably more
yeah.
than I'm aware of.
Massive
And if
following.
and these followers, if they're already primed to believe whatever these prophets are telling them, if the prophets tell them that this was a stolen election, they are going to believe it. Whether they don't care about evidence, they're already primed to ignore to ignore earthly evidence because they're looking at something that they consider divine and godly. So they don't
Exactly.
need the evidence. And I think that's
Exactly.
very dangerous.
And it doesn't
Like,
matter what you do to disprove otherwise, because during the 2020, the run up to it, and then shortly thereafter, I noticed a lot of these NAR apostles and prophets, they had predicted confidently from God. They said that Donald Trump was going to win, and not only win, he was going to beat Joe Biden by a landslide. And they said, God told me this is absolutely going to come to pass. And of course, when it didn't, they all got stuck with egg on their faces. And as we've seen, there's a connection here to, I think, your work, because a lot of these apostles and prophets, they've gone out and said, okay, we weren't wrong. The fact is, Trump did win. He actually did win. It was stolen. And the best way to explain that is the big lie. So
is the big
there's
lie. That's right. They
now
have
we're
a
in your
conflict.
realm.
Right. Well, they have a conflict of interest, to put it sort of in legal terms. If they were a judge, they wouldn't be allowed to sit on the case because their
Mm-hmm.
reputation is now on the line. Their reputation depends on the
Exactly.
big lie being true. But yeah, if you go, I guess what really gets me well, there's a lot of things that get me very concerned about this movement. I mean, number one, that they want to destroy the separation of church and state, which is implicit in
Yeah,
dominionism, right? So, and number two, as someone who comes from a Jewish background, I'm very concerned what that means for Jewish people. And it just drives me crazy. I mean, the expectation will be, of course, that Jews must convert. I think they're fine with Jews as long as they're Jews for Jesus. Not literally, it doesn't have to be Messianic Jews, is I guess the phrase.
Right.
As long as they accept Jesus as their savior, they're fine with most of them, not all of them, but many of them are going to be fine with Jews. But if you don't, I think that the plan will be to make life pretty miserable for anyone who doesn't accept their extreme version of Christianity. And that would include Jews and Muslims and even other Christians who are moderate or progressive.
Exactly. Just a different denomination.
Progressive. Right. They
Yeah.
consider progressive Christians demonic as well. And I think the idea will be to make life so miserable that, at least for the Jews, that they flee to Israel to fulfill that sort of prophecy. And so that concerns me. And then I'm so worried about the LGBTQ community because, I mean, it's not just about rolling back gay marriage. They will want to outlaw homosexuality, outlaw being, their very existence, LGBTQ, and not just trans, which is bad enough. We're talking about the people who are the most vulnerable in our society. They want to outlaw them. And,
exactly.
And that's just incredibly upsetting to me. And you can see that is their goal because some of them, so for example, John Eastman, the attorney who wanted to overturn the election based on a legal theory that he knew the Supreme Court, including Clarence Thomas, would reject. So he knew it was faulty theory. He is the head of an organization called NAM, the National Organization for Marriage. And he has championed legislation in Africa that outlaws, makes it a crime. And in fact, sometimes homosexuality is, I believe, you can get a life sentence. So it's very scary, I think, for the LGBTQ community. And then the other thing that really scares me about them, though, is that they rely on deception so much. So they have always wanted to destroy public education and replace it with unregulated private Christian schools and unregulated Christian homeschooling.
Yeah. And they've succeeded on so many levels. Yeah. It's a massive network.
Right. They don't admit that that's their goal. They've done all these stealth moves by, strangling public schools, not infiltrating government. First of all, the government mountain, they infiltrate it, and then they starve the public schools so that they don't have enough money. And then they attack the teachers with this manufactured outrage over things like the groomers campaign.
Yeah, critical race theory. Yeah.
And critical race theory, which had the effect, by the way, of deflecting from the truly massive pedophilia and sexual abuse scandals that have plagued Christian institutions.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, it's so ironic.
What better way to deflect?
Yeah, there is no massive pedophilia scandal plaguing the LGBTQ community.
No,
it's plaguing in the Christian churches, the Southern Baptist
denomination.
Church.
Yeah, 700
and the Catholic Church.
Yeah,
and Catholic the Mormon Church.
Exactly. Jehovah's Witnesses.
It's exploding right now, those scandals, and no one is talking about them politically because politically those same people in those institutions are instead demonizing the LGBTQ community in public schools as groomers. And it's infuriating that it's working. So they rely on this deception because they know that their policies are unpopular.
Yep.
So they know, at least a few years ago, people would have been horrified about the idea of eliminating public education. So instead, they come up with these fake things that deflect from the real things that are going on, and they get people to turn against the institution itself. And then, sorry, back to your question about the big lie.
Yeah.
Same exact thing. They relied on either willful blindness or deception, their own willful blindness or deception to sell the big lie. And if you go through it, almost all of the really viral debunked lies really began with and were made to go viral by members of this Christo-Fascist network. And it's just taken a while to figure out that these people are all part of that network. So for example, Jenna Ellis, she's now in Pennsylvania. She's on Doug Mastriano's campaign, but she worked with Giuliani, totally unqualified to have, represent the president of the United States. But guess what? She studied under Michael Ferris, who's huge in the Christo-Fascist movement. He's an attorney.
Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she was
Alliance
homeschooled
Defending
herself.
Freedom. Yeah.
And he wrote the introduction to her book. And so she's very much a part of that world. And I
very
think
connected.
it would be a good guess to think that probably it was Michael Ferris who got her the job. Because I am guessing there, though, that's speculation, but he
Mm-hmm.
did also write one of the legal briefs, the Texas one. I think it was Ken Paxton's legal brief trying to overturn the election. That was Michael Ferris, but he
Mm-hmm.
ghost wrote it. So he's trying to maintain this low profile. And he's also connected to, guess who, the Trump chief of staff, Mark Meadows,
Yeah,
who
they're all
has,
connected somehow, aren't they? If you trace it
right.
back
And
far enough, you'll find
you don't even,
they're
it's
all on
usually
each
just
other's
one step.
boards and things. Yeah.
It's usually just one step. So,
Yeah.
you always hear Mark Meadows, but nobody connects him to the Christo-Fascist network. And same thing with Jenna Ellis. I don't know. So, and then, so she spread the lie about more than one, I'm sure, but one of the big ones was that she used a chopped up video to falsely suggest that election workers in Georgia had told election observers to go home so that the workers could retrieve counterfeit ballots from under a table.
Of course they did.
Well, of course not. If you saw the whole video,
Right. In context.
they were unscanned ballots that the workers had themselves put into ballot containers, not suitcases, under the table. That was shown in the thing. And then they got a phone call from the director of elections asking them to stay longer. Why are you going home? So they had to retrieve those unscanned ballots and keep working.
Mm-hmm.
And the full video showed that it wasn't counterfeit ballots in suitcases. It's incredibly, it seems very deliberate. I don't know that she watched the whole video, but they had the whole video. Someone on Team Kraken had that whole video. And so that's Ellis. Then you have Doug Mastriano himself, who's running on a BS election integrity platform when he himself spread one of the most viral election lies about the Keystone State, Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
where that he relied on an image that had switched primary and general election data, creating the false impression that more mail ballots had been counted in Pennsylvania than were sent out. Clearly debunked by Reuters. You can look at the data yourself and see that it reversed, that the tweet used reversed data from the primary and general election. He's never taken it down. It was retweeted by Trump. At one point, it was up to like 50,000 retweets.
Wow.
So that's Mr. Election Integrity. His transition team includes Frank Ryan. I don't know if he's still in the Pennsylvania legislature, but he was a CPA who should know better, who originated the false viral claim, also parroted by Trump, that Pennsylvania had more votes than voters. And that claim turned out to be based on incomplete data. Not all of the voters had been entered into the system.
Mm-hmm.
But they also did a comparison with a system called SURE. And so this one is like a gift that keeps on giving, because even after the data was all updated, you had people, on Fox and part of this Christo-Fascist network saying, see, they still don't match. But the reason they still don't match is that the SURE system is a system that has nothing. It's not meant to tabulate the same information as how many people voted on election day. What it does is it updates the system continually as voters move and die, so that campaigns have an updated list from which to do their voter outreach, because they don't want to do voter outreach to people who've moved or died. So the two are never going to match. And he's a CPA, and so he's now on Mr. Election Integrity's transition team. And he's also Christo-Fascist. He just tweeted out a congratulations to Alan West, who was until recently the head of the Texas GOP, who's looks like he's in a Halloween costume. It's like a white robe with a giant red cross on it. And he says that Alan West said he'd been invested in the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem, Knights of Templar. And Frank Ryan welcomed him into their ranks.
Wow.
And it goes on.
We will be right back in just a few minutes with the second half of this conversation between me and Jennifer Cohn. Again, as I mentioned, she writes primarily for the Bucks County Beacon, and I'll put some of the links to some of the articles in the show notes, and we'll talk about at the end of the show how you can follow her, find her work beyond just the Bucks County Beacon stuff that she's doing. And we're going to get into kind of a continuation of the conversation I had just a couple weeks ago with Dr. Andre Gagne. We're going to be talking about dominionism, kind of what we talked about with him as a strategy of mobilization, Christian nationalism, some of the major players within the New Apostolic Reformation, or the NAR that we've already mentioned, these dominionists, these guys that are pushing the big lie, what's their motivation? And it really does go along, like I said, with the chat that I had last time with Dr. Andre Gagne. If you haven't heard that one, that's a really good dive into the background, the sort of theological background of these various streams or iterations of dominionism. And what really fascinates me about her journey is how she came to it through the front door, in a way, through this issue of looking at election integrity, election fraud, and of course then who are the people pushing the big lie. A lot of them are these NAR, so-called quote-unquote prophets and apostles. So we're going to get more into that in the second half, but I wanted to tell you about what's coming up here in the next few episodes here on Mindshift Podcast. It's just about time for us to start our deep dive into Doug Wilson. Is he a misunderstood pastor, or is he some sort of destructive cult leader on some sort of scale or spectrum? The next episode that's going to come out is a really long one. It's about 2 hours. I've already recorded it, and it's going to drop in a couple of weeks here. And then following that is going to be an episode with Kate West, and she grew up in the sort of Doug Wilson inspired household, the deeply patriarchal system, the stay-at-home daughters movement. A lot of his materials would have been prevalent in her homeschooling environment, and she's kind of repudiated that and now speaks out against it. So look for that one with Kate West. And then I'm going to be doing another episode on the many scandals attached with Doug Wilson. I'm doing the research on that now with a view to recording that soon. Then I've got an episode coming out with David Johnson. We're talking about this whole issue of a Christian defense or biblical defense of slavery, and that again relates to Doug Wilson. And then if there's enough interest, I'm going to do another episode on Doug Wilson's booklet, which he came out with, co-wrote with Stephen Wilkins of the League of the South back in 1996, called Southern Slavery as It Was. I've done a lot of research on that, something called the Theological War Thesis. So let me know if you want to go into that one. We can do another long episode on Doug Wilson, and we're also going to get into, probably the last episode on him is this issue of the bros that are in his orbit, the sort of dude bros, the bearded guys that are into the biblical patriarchy movement, sort of the second generation. Now that he's getting a bit older, he's passing the torch along to a whole another series of pastors who are spreading his toxic biblical patriarchy message far and wide. So he's had a lot of influences in a lot of realms. So we're doing a lot of stuff on Doug Wilson, and I'm already getting some pushback on Twitter, just tweeting out some things about Doug Wilson. So that's kind of interesting. Some of his followers are seriously, like, rabidly defending him. So look for some of those coming out too. So that's what's coming up. And then it's not too late as this episode drops. We've got our very last Mindshift Zoom call of 2022 on the 20th of November. We're going to be having Bruce Geringser. He was a recent guest on the show just a few episodes ago. He's an ex-independent fundamental Baptist pastor, now out of Ohio. He's got a fantastic story to tell. If you haven't heard that episode, you need to go back and catch it, kind of off the back of the one I did with Dave Warnock, two ex-pastors talking about their life stories and their experiences. So we're going to have Bruce drop in for our final Zoom call. How can you access that call with Bruce? You can become a member of the Patreon community. You can support the show. And speaking of which, I wanted to give a big thank you to Douglas Olds. He's the latest member of the Mindshift Podcast Patreon community. So thank you, Douglas, for your support, as well as Roz Galeto from Australia. So thank you for your support of the show. And if you want to learn how you can become a member of the Mindshift Podcast Patreon community, I will put the links in the show notes as always, and you can join our closed Mindshift Podcast Facebook group and get access to those calls. All right, let's get on back into the second half of the conversation here with Jennifer Cohn as we continue to look at this issue of the big lie and the New Apostolic Reformation, a Christo-Fascist network. It goes on and on. I know, because you start researching one person, and like we say, they're connected to some network, and they sit on each other's boards and they speak at each other's conferences. Well, and like you said, talking about election integrity, look at how corrosive the big lie has been. It hasn't gone away in 2 years, 2+ years. I mean, Trump was even talking about it in the run-up to the 2016 election, wasn't he? Saying things like, you know, I'm going to win unless it's rigged, of course. And then it's, if we know it's a rigged system. He was saying things like that years ago. And now with the midterms coming up, there's all these poll watchers that are trying to intimidate people to not vote or whatever. So it's such a corrosive thing, isn't it?
Well, it's very corrosive, but what I think that the public deserves to know is that it is almost to a T these religious zealots, you know,
Exactly. Who's back of a
the
lot of
Christian
this?
Taliban. I know that some people don't like that phrase, but I really don't know of an analogy that applies better. Christian ISIS, you know,
Yeah.
those are the people who are promoting this. So you even have Russ Ramsland. He's the disgraced supposed expert from that Allied Security Operations Group, which is tied to Michael Flynn. He's the guy who submitted a court affidavit that switched Michigan and Minnesota data to make it look like Michigan. Well, I don't know that that was his intent, but that's what it, I don't know that he intended to lie. I can't prove that.
Right.
But it had the effect of suggesting a massive irregularity in Michigan. And he's in the Council for National Policy, which is Ann Nelson wrote a whole book about them called Shadow Network. It's an umbrella group for the Christian right and billionaires.
And it's been around a long time. The early 1980s, I think. It's been
Yeah,
around for decades. Yeah, it's one of the early groups that was founded in the sort of beginning movement of the Christian right, coming out of things like the moral majority and other things. So yeah, the CNP's been doing a lot of stuff, and they're very secretive. We didn't even know, even now, I'm not sure we know who all is a member of it. They've been super secretive about their membership list, haven't they?
well, right. Brent Allpress I think he is with at It's Documented. But in any event, Brent Allpress, who's on Twitter, he's done a great job of obtaining somehow and publishing CNP lists. He actually has one, a fairly recent one from January 2022. So you can see
Yeah,
it, like Ollie
it's getting
Alexander has
out
been a
there.
member, and Charlie
Yeah.
Kirk, who did buses to the Capitol, has been a member.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Michael Flynn even had, I don't know if he's on the membership list officially, but he is some kind of he did something official with the CNP. Ginny Thomas, CNP. Mike Lindell, I don't know if he's CNP, but he's with The Family, which is that terrifying Netflix series produced by, and books, two books also written by Jeff Charlotte,
Mm-hmm.
which is very much a very secretive Christo-Fascist, all
Yeah.
about power
Yeah, it's a dominionist
organization.
organization. It really, they're the ones who host the prayer breakfast, and that's the Jonathan Larson connection, isn't it? Somehow he was able to
Exactly.
obtain a guest list and some of the donors lists of some of these family sponsored events, and he's been doing a huge amount of work uncovering who's invited and who's invited whom to these events. And I think that was basically his argument, was that they went after Mike Lindell, looking at him like a whale, basically, and he was radicalized really by people from the family. And since that time, he's just gone completely out in left field, pushing the big lie, and he's got all this,
Well,
social media
exactly. And
networks and everything.
yeah, he was vulnerable because he said he's a recovering crack cocaine addict.
Exactly, and he
So
happens to be a
they
billionaire.
prey, and he happened to be a millionaire, and they
Yeah.
prey on these vulnerable people. Oftentimes it's also people who embezzlers, convicted, you know,
Mm-hmm.
felons. They prey on them because they say, we will love you as long as you declare your love for Jesus, then you're one of us and we accept you.
Exactly.
And it gives them a doorway back into respectability, I suppose.
Yep.
And I mean, yeah, Mike Lindell did some pretty horrible things. I think well, I don't want to get it wrong, but he did some pretty horrible things that I've read about.
Yeah.
And yet the family now has, you know, welcomed them into their warm Christo-fascist embrace, and that's pretty intoxicating. He came out and claimed to have absolute proof in the form of internet packet captures that
Mm.
China had hacked the election. And his own expert called later on said, "All right, I'm out. I've had enough.
Yeah, this is a bridge too
They're a
far.
turd.
Yeah.
They're a turd." And it wasn't just him; it was also independent experts.
Right.
So Lindell had promised, he lured all of these experts to come to his big symposium
Yeah, it was
in
supposed to be a big expose,
2021.
wasn't it? That fell flat. He's never
Because he didn't,
produced
and
the goods.
he never produced the goods. He never produced the PCAPs,
No,
because
but he's
I
been.
gather because he figured out that, or he was told his experts were going to expose them as being turds. They were
Yeah,
not what he
exactly.
claimed that they were. So
Well, yeah,
I don't know. I think there's a connective tissue between seemingly random people coming forward, all actually not being random. They all knew each other before. Let me put it that way. They
yeah,
all knew each other, including Joel
yeah,
Olstein, the guy who started the whole I was on an Antifa call with a guy at Dominion, Christo-Fascist, same
Mm-hmm.
freaking network. They all knew each other.
Exactly. They're all related on these Zoom calls like you talked about. Because I read an article recently, there was a deleted call, speaking of Bruce Wilson, and he was able to
Oh, right.
download it. You probably saw
I
this
don't know
on
how he did
Twitter.
that.
I don't know how he did
Yeah,
it, but he saved this
freaking brilliant.
call. And basically, Doug Mastriano out of Pennsylvania praised this prayer, which is just absolutely laden with all this dominionist spiritual warfare language. And he breaks it down. There's an article about it and kind of explains what is Mastriano talking about, and it's everything we're mentioning here. He can speak the language, and he's denied that he's a dominionist and he's affiliated with any of these people, but his language says otherwise, doesn't it?
Yeah, I don't think he can deny anymore that he's affiliated with the
Exactly.
with the NAR, because there is a woman who, although she scrubbed some of the key references from her internet website and stuff, but it was already archived. There's a woman named Abby Abledness who works in Pennsylvania with the Pennsylvania Prayer Caucus, who is she said on her Amazon book, the biography part of her book, said that her job is to spread the prayer networks of Cindy Jacobs and
Mm-hmm.
John Boniface, who are both recognized apostles in the New Apostolic Reformation. And she even said that she was commissioned as an apostle by John Boniface. So yeah, Mastriano and Abby Abledness have done multiple events together. I don't mean they just both showed up. Like they had,
Yeah,
they
it was
organized the
planned and
events.
orchestrated. Yeah.
Right. And so yeah, they can't really say that. There's another connection to this NAR that I really want to point out with January 6th, which is that, how everyone said that it was sort of this last second thing that Trump, that it wasn't a pre-existing plan to breach the barriers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's just not true. The map for January 6th that was widely spread among these networks, in part by Steve Bannon's War Room and even by the Oath Keepers leader, Stuart Rhodes, and others,
Mm-hmm.
it was created by a woman named Mercedes Sparks, who did a whole video on it. And it said specifically, we must take to the US Capitol steps. Those were off limits, and there were barriers all around the Capitol to keep you from getting that far. And not only that, she said they expected 3 million people. So this woman, who, by the way, is the VP of operations for NAR leader Lance Wallnau, who we've talked
There he
about.
is again.
I mean, she was thinking that they were going to send 3 million people to the Capitol steps.
Wow.
You know, to me, that's a huge deal. It shows advanced knowledge that they plan to breach the barriers, or certainly implies it. Maybe she didn't know
Mm.
there would be barriers. I don't know. But in the same video, she talked about her friend Steve, who I figured out was that does our shows, is what she says. So, because she and Lance Wall now do all these shows together, these, NAR shows, Christo-Fascist shows.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it turned out it's this guy named Steve Brown, who's deeply embedded into the network, into the Christo-Fascist network too. And he was on the permits for both the Jericho Hear the Church Roar rally in December 2020
Right.
and on the One Nation Under God permit for January 6th. And according to Mercedes Sparks, he was helping with all of the events for January 6th. So, and
It all
it's
comes
back to
around.
it is largely the New Apostolic Reformation, but it's even a little bigger than that. It's the family, and it's their networks,
It is. Well, how much of it?
beyond the NAR.
Yeah. How much of it do you find another thread we haven't talked about, and that's Christian nationalism? Because when I was looking at the January 6th insurrection, I did a couple of episodes on some of the things that I saw in the footage, and there was an intersection of the sort of dominionist piece, the Christian nationalist piece, as well as QAnon. And then you throw in like you mentioned, the military aspects of it, the militia groups and things. You've got all these things coming together, and that's all
Right.
around Trump's big lie as well. How much of the Christian nationalist piece have you seen as well?
I feel like the unfortunately, because these terms are not dictionary terms, that
Hmm,
people define them a little differently. And so Christian
sure.
nationalism, I've seen some people, I saw a recent piece that really equated it with dominionism. They just said it's the same thing. To me, I prefer dominionism because I think it's more clear.
It
You could
is,
say
yeah.
that you could say that Christian nationalism, I've also seen that just defined as to mean that you think that we're a Christian nation, which is a little ambiguous as to the fallout from that.
Right.
Does that mean, if you just want to say that, maybe some people are okay with that. Now, if you're talking about destroying the separation of church and state, and suddenly we have morality police and gay people
Yeah.
are
Handmaid's Tale.
illegal. Yeah, gay people are illegal. And, even if you're going to die without an abortion, you can't get one. That's different. And so I don't necessarily, I feel like if you're a dominionist, you're by definition a Christian nationalist.
You
But
probably are. Yeah. Well,
the,
they
the
are
militia
interconnected.
element
Yeah.
the militia element certainly connects to these groups, and one of the ways they connect is through the Black Robe Regiment, which I
Yes.
also have written about, which is essentially a group of, in my mind, insane pastors who they take a vow to. Well, the myth is that in the, oh gosh, I'm going to screw up the myth. I think it's during the American Revolution. The idea is that these pastors supposedly took up arms and fought.
Yes. They were
And
like
that's
fighting pastors.
right. And it's popular. The myth is popularized. There's elements of it that are not true, and the mythical parts of it have been popularized by a guy named David Barton, who's a Seven Mountains proponent,
Yes. I was going to bring him
probably
up.
an R. Yeah,
He's probably
he's
the
one of
biggest, one of the biggest proponents of Christian nationalism for sure. And he's
and
tied into these networks as well.
well, he's definitely one of the biggest proponents of destroying the separation of church and state. He
Yeah.
says that they were never meant to be separate, and he seems to be some kind of a thought leader because he couches anything in like pseudo intellectualism, historianism. In
Yeah.
any event, so yeah, he's kind of a big guy. But the Black Robe Regiment, there are multiple groups because it's really a movement. I guess it's the Black Robe Regiment movement. So there are going to
Hmm.
be multiple groups that call themselves the Black Robe Regiment. One of the biggest ones is called America's Black Robe Regiment. And that one partnered expressly with, I don't know if they use the word partnered, but Michael Flynn commissioned new members into it during his Reawaken America tour, in at least 2 stops, including Pennsylvania recently. And I warned about it in advance, and nobody really picked up the story. I don't know why, because I thought it was a big deal. They partnered. That particular regiment had on its website, if you go back, not anymore, but if you go back to the archives, they partnered with the Oath Keepers in 2021. And yes, they were there on January 6th. There was a presence. And there's another Black Robe Regiment group that has ties to Roger Stone.
Well, and
And
we're seeing an increasing marriage, I guess you could call it, or maybe a marriage of convenience between the Christian right and the alt right. That's another piece that's to add to what you were saying. This is something that came out during the Trump era, wasn't it? That you see this embrace of militia groups by the Christian right. They have the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys showing up at these prayer events, and you're like, what the hell? What's going on here?
exactly.
But this is all
Well,
part and parcel of this movement.
well, that's always the danger is of religion, is it lets you whitewash really terrible behavior just because
Yeah.
if you say Jesus enough and that you've been saved. That's what Roger Stone is running around doing, but that's what slave owners did
Yeah.
in the South. They all were good Christians, and that's what they do that's a very convenient way of making crimes against humanity seem godly,
Yeah.
to sell it to people.
Exactly.
But
Well,
but yeah.
go ahead. I was going to say the Christian nationalist piece, as I understand it, there is a difference between the dominionist angle and the Christian nationalism. This is something I picked up from Andre Gagne, and he said that you
Mhm.
have to look at dominionism is the strategy of mobilization. The Christian nationalism piece is essential because if America was a Christian nation originally, has strayed from that path and needs to become one again, how do we go about making America Christian again? And the answer is the strategy of dominion, taking dominion. When we do those 7 mountains or whichever strategy you use, then you have arrived at the Christian nationalist platform, and that's their strategy. That's one way to see it. I think that was kind of a helpful way for me to distinguish between dominionism and actual Christian nationalism, if that makes any sense.
It does. That's a good way to describe it. One is more
Yeah.
of an action, and it is much more, but it is still more specific. That's the dominionism part,
Yeah, that's
which
the
is why I think
strategy.
which I think is why it's more useful. So now you even see, one thing that the far right is very good at is normalizing terminology. So now they're embracing the Christian nationalist label, and you can see with Lance Wallnau, to use he's a flip flopper on this issue. There
Hmm.
was a video of him where he literally said, from a year or two ago, he said, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist. And then you had him after a recent Rolling Stone piece freaking out and saying, I'm not a Christian nationalist. What is Christian
I
nationalism?
never said that. Never heard of it.
Yeah, what the hell is Christian nationalism?
Yeah.
And then you
What?
have after the was it NPR did the piece on Michael Flynn's Reawaken America tour using the phrase Christian nationalism. And so Flynn comes out and says that Flynn, I guess I am a Christian nationalist. And suddenly Walno goes, woohoo, we're all Christian nationalists. So now
Right.
he's,
I guess it's okay.
which is why, and apparently there was I don't know who did the poll, but there was some poll that showed 45% of Americans are okay with America being a Christian nation, or so they're normalizing Christian nationalism, but
Oh, yeah.
I don't think enough people understand what that means. And to understand it, you have to talk about dominionism.
Exactly. Well, I think that's what I would point people to Perry and Whitehead's book, Taking America Back for God, because they showed through, comprehensive surveys of religion, that Christian nationalism was the number one driver for white evangelicals voting for Trump in 2016. And that's been proven statistically, by survey questions. So it's a huge driver. It's like it's in the groundwater of evangelicalism. They just kind of assume, oh yeah, of course America was a Christian nation and we're not one anymore, but we need to become one again. So they're prime for strategies like Dominion. So when a guy from the Family Research Council shows up to your church and it's a get out the vote sort of drive, they start using Seven Mountains Mandate language. This is what you need to do as a person in the pew. You go out and take dominion over that mountain of your business, or if you're a teacher, that's the mountain you're called to, is education or media or arts or whatever, or government. And it's your particular strategy. And they're using it now as a mobilization strategy as well.
Well, I think that's right. And the Christian, evangelicals anyway, have extremely high turnout. So even though they're only about 13% of the population, they have about 26% turnout. And part of that is they do have this, my most recent article is largely about that. There's the United in Purpose is a Seven Mountains really nonprofit. That is their express goal. Started by a embezzler who discovered probably the family or something adjacent, so he found his way back into respectability. And it's this very shady organization that is basically a Christian Cambridge Analytica, complete with leaking 191 million voter data files conveniently in 2015 that landed on a Russian server. So
I'm sure it was coincidence. It has to be,
sure
Jennifer. None of that was planned.
But there's one thing I want to talk about, which is the white nationalism versus Christian nationalism.
Right.
It's not as, a lot of people want to say that this is all about Christian nationalism is really white nationalism. And I think there is an element of that, but there has been, and we would be remiss to overlook the significant outreach that they're doing to the Black community and to the Hispanic community. And it's sort of like the Proud Boys. It reminds me of that in the sense that they are almost all Christian nationalists are willing to join forces with white nationalists. But they may not personally harbor these prejudices. Not every one of them hates Black people or hates Hispanic people, or but they are willing to sell them down the river in order to acquire power. And so that's where you have the really Nick Fuentes, who has his Groyper's movement. It's called America First. I didn't know I knew him as a white nationalist. I didn't even know he was a Christian nationalist until like a few months ago. And that he joined forces with the Jericho March, and they lift the wooden cross during the Jericho March. That was his Groyper's. And Marjorie Taylor Greene has made sure to, she's sort of been the designated, I don't know what, emissary who went to his conference,
spokesperson,
to make sure that, because he can turn out a frightening crowd.
Oh, and huge numbers. Yeah.
Yep. And
there was an interesting thing on him.
And so, she may not hate Black people or Jews or whatever. I mean, she's probably does, but I don't know what she hates. Regardless, though, she is willing. And even Ollie Alexander, who does not have white skin, was willing to join forces with racists. And he said that expressly. And by the way, Ollie Alexander is a complete Christian zealot, a Catholic. They call themselves the radical traditional Catholics, Radcath or Tradcath, something like that. That's Steve Bannon is sort of in charge of that, the Christian extremists.
Yeah,
So,
I came across Nick Fuentes about,
I
I
mean, the
don't know, maybe
Catholics, sorry,
six or
Catholic.
eight, yeah, 6 or 8 months ago. There was a thing here in the UK. Louis Theroux, he did a documentary on him, and not just him, but Christian nationalist extremists, this new rising movement in America. And I'm like, what the hell? What's going on? He's got a huge, massive following, and he just rants and everything. And yeah, so that's another element we have to watch out for. Well, I know you probably got to get going. We're getting close to an hour. The question I guess I have is, now you've done all this research, you're doing more and more work. Where do you see this movement going? Because one of the things Andre Gagne said, he said, look, let's just be honest, they're not going away. They're not going away anytime
No.
soon. Where do you see this thing ending up? What's their end game?
Well, their end game is dominionism, and
Mm,
not just in the US, it's for the world. And they do work with Russia, by the way. A lot of, maybe not all of them, but certainly that's through the World Congress of Families. Um, I don't, yeah, they're definitely not going away. And I would say that it's really key to warn the majority of the public about them so that they vote accordingly before, tomorrow, for example.
mm,
And in the 2024 election, we're really in a race against time because this is an information war and they've created these information bubbles, and they really truly rely on deception to to move the country toward dominionism, and they're not using that word, and most of the public doesn't know that that is the end game and
mm-hmm.
what that would mean for them. And I think it's really a challenge for the media to get ahead of that, and that's what we've got to just continue to try to do regardless of how this election goes tomorrow.
It's true. I mean, I'm grateful for people like yourself who are doing the hard work. The hard, you said before we hit record that doing that last article literally like made you sick. It was just, it takes a huge toll on us, doesn't it, to do all this work and research, doesn't it? But it is
It
worth it if
does.
we can educate people. And we said before we hit record too, the frightening aspect of all of this, certainly the MAGA side of it, the Trumpism and all that, it's got a lot of cult-like or cultish elements. Maybe Amanda Marcotte would say it's cult-ish, and so that's another piece we didn't really get into, but that's a concern as well, surely, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I'd say that MAGA, I would say that these religious zealots have completely infiltrated the MAGA movement.
Yeah.
Even though Trump himself obviously probably doesn't believe in God,
No,
he's
he's no
happy to have
Christian.
them. He's happy to have these people worship him as having been chosen by God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd say those two have been really fused together. And there are other obviously fringe elements, but almost all of them claim to have these really extreme Christian views that are sort of the flip side. I mean, that's really the great irony, is there was a rule um against getting too close to the Capitol after 9/11, when we had Islamic extremists attack the United
Mm-hmm.
States. And what you had, unfortunately, on January 6th was really Christian extremists breaching those barriers and wanting to take those steps. And so it's, to a very large extent, the flip side of the same coin. And I'd say extremism, no matter which religion it comes from, leads to no good. It's very dangerous.
It's true. Yeah. Fundamentalism or extremism. And, like you
Mhm.
said, you go back in your article in the Bucks County Beacon, there's a picture I thought was really interesting. Someone took a picture of the flyer that they held a meeting at I think it was Trump Tower. It was held on
Right.
June 21st, 2016, with Donald Trump and Ben Carson. There was about 1,000 evangelicals there. And you just look at some of the speakers and some of the topics, state of the country, George Barna, Christian mobilization, Ralph Reed. I mean, these are big names on the Christian right. The Power of Unity, Ben Carson, Mike Huckabee, Franklin Graham, James
Yep.
Robeson, Pastor Carl Lentz, who of course now has been disgraced of Hillsong, New York, Tony Perkins of the Family Research Council, Eric Metaxas, and so these guys
Yeah.
were
Who
doing
he
this in
Metaxas?
2016.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Metaxas hosted that Jericho march here, the Church
Exactly.
War rally. Yeah, and Ben Carson is an interesting one. The reason I had been wanting to write about the United in Purpose data mining, the Christian Cambridge Analytica group, for a while, but it's kind of hard because it wasn't really exactly breaking news in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But Ben Carson rallying for Mastriano, I saw, was an opportunity because he's the one who orchestrated he and United in Purpose, that the Christian Cambridge Analytica, they're the ones who orchestrated that meeting in June 2016 with Trump.
Mm.
And it was Ben Carson, and Ben Carson just rallied with Mastriano, and everyone dismisses him because he seems like he's half asleep, and I think he probably is half asleep. But he is part of that network. And he's, I believe, the one who was designated to recruit Mike Lindell into the family. And he's associated with the family as well.
Exactly. So again, it all comes full. So I'm glad, like I said, that people like you are starting to put those connections together or making it more public. How can people find you? What's the best place to get a hold of you on social media?
Well, sadly, with it under attack, I pretty much put almost all of my eggs in the Twitter basket. But I'm
Right.
on
Now that
Twitter.
Musk is
I'm not
taking it
planning.
over.
Yeah, I'm not planning on leaving unless I'm thrown off, which I guess could happen. But
It could
I'm
happen, or he
pretty
starts charging you.
at Jenny Cohn 1, JennyCohn 1. I will continue writing for the Bucks County Beacon. So you can find me there. You can also find me under Jennifer Cohn on Medium and under Jennifer Cohn on YouTube, which I probably will start using my YouTube channel more, partly because of what's happening with Twitter, but also just for a change of pace. And let's see. And I'm also on kofi.com, KOFI.com, if people want to support my work.
Right. So there's a multiplicity of ways people can find you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I know you've been struggling with a cold. This article took it out of you, but thank you so much for getting through this interview. I've absolutely been fascinated to talk to you and find out even more about this work. I love the fact that you came at it from the election integrity and that led you into all this other stuff. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you. It was really a great conversation. I enjoyed it very much.